There are few RPGs out there that inspire as much nostalgia and reverence as the original Baldur's Gate series. Veteran RPG players talk wistfully about the games, particularly Bg2, and the series has served as an inspiration for games released long after, frequently marketed as quote-unquote spiritual successors to Baldur's Gate. But what about a game that is both temporally distant, and in terms of its presentation, sufficiently distant from the originals that nonetheless bears the name Baldur's Gate? I don't wish for this to be a review so much as my thoughts on a fairly anticipated game. It goes without saying that having Baldur's Gate in the title of any game brings back both memories as well as rather grand expectations, and it was big news indeed when Larian announced Baldur's Gate 3 in 2019. Certainly kindled interest and excitement, as many people made lots of assumptions, perhaps justifiably so, about what type of game it would be. When the first gameplay was shown, it produced, for better or worse, mixed reactions, with the biggest issue being, of course, the fact that it would not be an isometric RPG in the same style as the original Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. And I can certainly understand both sides on this issue. On the one hand, the large majority of people with interests in the game were older, veteran gamers who were intimately familiar with the original Baldur's Gate, and therefore wanted fidelity to the original, perhaps with improved graphics and prettier colors, but basically the same game in terms of its presentation. On the other hand, understanding the other side of the equation is also no great feat. Most people these days, even RPG players, are not huge fans of the isometric style, because for many, it is simply dated, and Larian Studios obviously does not want to only attract the oldest players from the good old days, but also new players. And hand in hand went the complaint from the old school devotees that Bg3 essentially looked like a souped-up version of Divinity Original Sin 2. And to a very large extent, it does. Larian Studios is using the Divinity Engine 4.0, which is a continuation of the engines they have used for their Divinity games. And it makes sense. It would indeed be a bit strange for them to use some upgraded form of an old Infinity engine. And so on this point, I'm not sure what people were expecting. Developers make use of engines they have used in the past and are familiar with, and it would have been highly unusual for Larian to take on a completely different engine than the one that they're accustomed to. I think we need to allow for some flexibility as IPs evolve and change over time, and in some sense, it is the distinction between holding to the letter of something versus its spirit. Baldur's Gate 3 holds to the spirit of the original games rather than the letter, and evolution and change are to be expected, even if such things are not good. That said, I don't personally think the UI or the overall visuals are particularly egregious, and in general, they look quite decent. Either way, I don't think this is a sort of deal breaker, but the issue did need to be gotten out of the way since it was the one that had provoked the most controversy in the beginning. Gameplay has been unsurprisingly in many ways similar to Larian's Divinity titles, and this too produced controversy. Many people were upset about this as they felt it resembled their previous games too much, with it being turn-based and environmentally driven, i.e. oil being lit up by fire, water being electrified, and enemies being pushed off ledges. This again was to be expected, and I think it's unreasonable given the engine they are using that this particular aspect of the game would be radically different from their previous titles. Once Larian accepted the task of making Baldur's Gate 3, certain elements were effectively locked into place, and I, for one, don't see them as a deal breaker, though in a different world alternatives might have been welcome. When it comes to the classes, the implementation has been fairly well done. Larian has remained true to 5th edition, which I have to be perfectly honest about, I do not know, as I stopped paying attention to D&D rules after 3.5. Some people actually complain about the implementation of 5th edition, but as Wizards of the Coast had to greenlight the project, what else could it have been? The classes do seem to be fairly well implemented, and they're differentiated enough to make choosing each one a meaningful choice, both in terms of playstyle and story. Naturally, there's some overlap between some of them, as there would be, for example, between mages and sorcerers, but also crucial differences. And to my mind, the more important element is the consequentiality of your classes as they pertain to the story. Even in early access, for example, there are dialogue and story-relevant distinctions between classes, even if they are minor and small, and this gives the player the feeling that their choices matter. And during the adventure, playing a mage, of course, will be sufficiently different from playing a ranger, beyond simple differences in combat. This stems from my own view, of course, that classes matter, a great deal in fact, and being able to feel the differences in class, not just in terms of gameplay, but also in terms of story, can make an RPG truly worthwhile. After all, if a mage feels the same as a thief or a druid, what really is the point? And in this regard, Larian Studios has done an excellent job, based on the limited experience from early access, of course. Given that it is early access, it's difficult to say very much about the story, because stories that are incomplete are difficult to judge or analyze. But I think the story is decently promising. The major plot point, of course, is that illithids, or mind flayers, have implanted a tadpole larva into your brain, and that you need to remove it lest you become a mind flayer yourself. You're given the opportunity to make use of this tadpole to pass dialogue tests, as well as gain special powers, and there are even cutscenes with your inner tadpole embodied, should you choose to go down that route. But I have to admit that for me, I could see no pressing reason to pursue that path. It seems predictably risky, as there exists some possibility of becoming an illithid, although admittedly there is likely plot armor protecting you from that, and it doesn't seem to offer much in terms of advantage over resisting its power. At least not one that I can't pass up and be perfectly fine with. In short, I'm not tempted at all, and that should be a top priority on the part of Larian to make the tadpole route a very tempting one. One that really feels like missing out, should you decide to forego it, as opposed to it being merely an option. One can only hope that the consequences, both negative and positive, will be great if one chooses to go down the illithid path, and that the choice will be both extremely appealing and dire, should you choose to make it. Intermingled, of course, with the risk of becoming a mind flayer is the return of everyone's favorite evil divine trio, the so-called Dead Three, or Bane, Merkel, and Baal. Long ago mortals who attained divinity in ages past through sheer ambition, power, and force of will, but who have fallen upon hard times in the last century or two. Although they are not explicitly mentioned, due to data mining and other illusions, for example, you can become their priest, so even though they're not full deities, it seems very likely that all three gods will be highly relevant to the game, and in this sense, the divine urgency which so characterized the original Baldur's Gate series appears slated to continue. On top of that, there's the open question of who or what the Absolute is, a deific being that may or not be related to the Dead Three. And apart from the main plot, there are nice little tidbits of lore strewn about the game to whet the appetite of any D&D aficionado sufficiently. References to other gods, places such as Thay, as well as the opportunity to explore different environments such as the Underdark. Now, of course, as this is early access, as mentioned earlier, there's only so much one can say about the story, but so far, so good. There's nothing earth-shatteringly interesting about it, but it's also not too bad. One of the major selling points of the original Baldur's Gate series was the presence of companions that accompanied you on your journey and had distinct personalities, alignments, and quests. You could romance some of them, and romances would stretch across the sagas, and many of the characters were very memorable. Baldur's Gate 3 also has companions, of course, and it would be hard not to hold them up in comparison to the original companions of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. Now, I think Baldur's Gate 3 is a somewhat mixed bag when it comes to companions. Some are decent, some are not, and others are pretty good. So let me start with my least favorite, and I do mean least favorite, Astarian. Astarian is, to my mind, either a meme or pure fan service. He reeks of unnecessary hyperbole. The handsome, androgynous, emo vampire bad boy that needs saving, but is also fun to be seduced by and to flirt with. I wonder who he was written for. Guess that's a tough one. On top of that, he's in a bind, effectively a slave to his vampire master, Cazador, which of course amplifies the needing saving aspect of his character. If you could see past the fact that he's a walking trope concocted for the express purpose of fan service to a certain crowd, he remains a fairly unpleasant individual, with very little redeeming to him. I suppose you could simply attribute this to him being a vampire spawn, but regardless, if I could simply cut a companion out and replace him with somebody else, it would be Astarian. Perhaps remove the tadpole from him and let him burn in the sun. Companions that aren't memes but rather boring and uninteresting are Lae'zel and Will. Lae'zel, from the little interaction we get, just seems like a typical Githyanki. She behaves like one, thinks like one, and shows little potential for personal development. Beyond this, there might be some potential down the line, as she realizes the true desires and imperatives of Lakith the Githyanki Lich Queen, but until then, I'm not holding my breath. Though as a fairly powerful fighter, she's no slouch in the combat department. Will is decent enough, but a mortal who has fallen for the power of a devil is not that rare a thing, since his heroism and bravery appear to be largely a front, it's hard to find him likable. Even after this is revealed and you speak to him, it's hard to get a sense of genuine decency from him. Now, of course, such things are not a requirement for good character. He doesn't need to be likable. But I just find him transparently uninteresting. The two least cookie-cutter companions, to my mind, are Gale and Shadowheart. Shadowheart has depth, inasmuch as she is too blinded by her faith in Shar, in much the same way Lae'zel is blinded by her faith in Vlaakith. But unlike Lae'zel, there are bits of humanity that occasionally bubble to the surface, and upon gaining her trust, there appears to be more than meets the eye. Even rescuing her after the ship produces a sense of gratitude, and with Shadowheart I can see a great deal of character development potential that I find difficult to imagine Lae'zel, though I don't want to be too categorical about it. And Gale, I would argue, is the most interesting and compelling of the characters. Driven by his arrogance and love of Mystra, he is paying a horrible price for his assumptions about himself and the world, as well as his goddess. Despite all of this, there's something decidedly nice about him, even good. Indeed, if alignment were a thing in BG3, I could easily label him as chaotic good. He is secretive, but not too off-putting in his secrecy, and even if he is good, I could still easily see him falling for the temptation of power again. And that makes him strangely and interestingly unpredictable, and as such, he's definitely my number one pick for a companion. But how do the Bg3 Companions stand up to the original Baldur's Gate Companions? Fairly well, in some sense, but in another sense not so well, as I think it's a bit of comparing apples to oranges, as there are just too many differences between the games. For example, in BG3, you have so much more interaction with your companions, and it is early access and thus not finished. All that said, you will be able to play each companion and therefore experience things from a vastly different perspective than simply having them around for the ride. As far as the setting is concerned, I don't have much to say. It's really too early to tell. Baldur's Gate, the city itself, will surely make up a big chunk of the game, but we can't see the city yet, and therefore it's simply impossible to tell during early access. Now, Baldur's Gate's strength, at the end of the day, has mostly to do with Larian's strength, which is a certain open-endedness with which they approach their games. Larian is not a master storyteller, even if their stories are pretty good. Rather, the sheer range of possibilities on offer, from how you approach combat, to the order in which you do things, to whom you side with, creates opportunities that few games offer, including the original Baldur's Gate series. For example, whether or not you side with the goblins or the druids is a decision bound to have consequences down the line, even if they are not immediately discernible in early access. But is Baldur's Gate 3 a worthy heir to the original? I am inclined to think yes, based on the limited input we can get from early access. It's certainly not without its flaws, to be sure, some of which I have mentioned above, but it does ultimately try to be true to the spirit of both Dungeons & Dragons and the sense of adventure that characterized the original games. Sure, some purists will disagree, but were we honestly ever going to get a carbon copy of the original in the 2020s? Probably not. I, for one, have reasonable faith that Larian Studios will put out a product that is both good and close enough to the spirit of the original games that one can still feel a connection between the two without straining credulity. As always, thank you for watching. Do leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll check you out next time. Do take care.